They discovered mountains of gold, entire rivers flowing with silver, treasures beyond imagination that could have made Spain the eternal ruler of the world. But within a century, the Spanish Empire, once the most powerful force on earth, was bankrupt, broken, and begging for loans. How does an empire drown in gold? How do you become poor while holding the world's richest mines in your hands? This is the story of the greatest economic paradox in history, where infinite wealth became infinite ruin. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below telling us what would you do if you suddenly had access to unlimited gold. Stay with us, because what happened to Spain will shock you. The year was 1492. Spain had just completed the Reconquista, uniting the kingdom under Catholic rule. Ferdinand and Isabella sat on their thrones, exhausted but victorious. They had driven out the Moors, consolidated power, and married their children into every royal house in Europe. They were respected, yes, powerful, certainly, but rich? Not quite. The royal treasury was strained. Wars are expensive. Maintaining an army, feeding a court, building cathedrals, it all costs money. Spain was no richer than France, no more prosperous than England. They were players on the European stage, but not the stars. Then Christopher Columbus walked into their court. He was a strange man, obsessed with an idea that most considered insane, sailing west to reach the east. The Portuguese had laughed him out of their kingdom. Other nobles dismissed him as a dreamer. But Ferdinand and Isabella were desperate enough to gamble. They gave him 3 ships, a small crew, and their blessing. What happened next changed everything. Columbus returned with tales of a new world, not the spices of India he'd promised, but something else entirely: land, people, and rumors of gold. At first, the gold was modest, trinkets, small amounts. But the Spanish explorers kept pushing deeper into the Americas, and then they found it. Potosi, a mountain in present-day Bolivia that was almost entirely made of silver. When the Spanish conquistadors first saw it, they couldn't believe their eyes. The indigenous people had known about it for generations, but had never exploited it on an industrial scale. The Spanish had no such reservations. Within years, Potosi became the most valuable piece of land on earth. They built a city around the mountain, forced thousands of indigenous workers into brutal labor, and began extracting silver at a rate the world had never seen. Entire fleets of ships sailed from the Americas to Seville, loaded with silver bars, gold coins, and precious stones. Spain was suddenly drowning in wealth. King Philip II, grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella, inherited this golden empire. He was a serious man, deeply religious, and convinced that God had chosen Spain to lead the world. With the treasure fleets arriving regularly, he seemed unstoppable. He built the largest navy in the world, the Spanish Armada. He funded wars across Europe to defend Catholicism. He constructed magnificent palaces, including the stunning El Escorial. The Spanish court became legendary for its opulence. Nobles wore silk and velvet imported from the Far East. They ate off silver plates. They decorated their homes with art from the greatest masters. Gold flowed through Madrid like water through a fountain. Other European monarchs watched with envy and disbelief. How could Spain have so much? How could one kingdom control such wealth? But beneath the glittering surface, something dangerous was brewing, something that would turn Spain's golden dream into an economic nightmare. Philip II sat in his study one evening, reviewing reports from his finance ministers. Despite the endless flow of silver from the Americas, despite the treasure fleets that arrived like clockwork, the royal treasury was somehow empty. He frowned, confused. Where was all the money going? His advisors assured him it was temporary. Just a few more shipments from Potosi and everything would be fine. Just one more treasure fleet. But Philip had a gnawing feeling in his gut that something was terribly wrong. What he didn't realize was that Spain was about to learn the hardest economic lesson in history, and it would cost them everything. The problem wasn't that Spain didn't have gold. The problem was that Spain had too much gold, and they didn't know what to do with it. When the first treasure ships arrived, the Spanish economy exploded with activity. Merchants bought goods from across Europe. The crown funded massive construction projects. Soldiers were paid handsomely. Everyone felt rich. But then prices started to rise. At first, no one noticed. A loaf of bread cost a little more, rent went up slightly, wages increased to match. It seemed like prosperity. But it wasn't prosperity, it was inflation, and it was about to spiral out of control. Here's what was happening. Spain was flooding its economy with silver and gold, but it wasn't producing anything of value to match that wealth. They weren't building industries. They weren't investing in agriculture or manufacturing. They were simply spending the money as fast as it came in, and often faster. The Spanish crown bought weapons from German blacksmiths. They purchased grain from France. They imported textiles from Flanders, luxury goods from Italy, spices from the East. Spanish gold flowed out of Spain and into the pockets of foreign merchants and manufacturers. Meanwhile, Spain's own industries withered. Why would a Spanish craftsman spend years perfecting his trade when he could make more money as a bureaucrat managing colonial wealth? Why would a farmer toil in the fields when he could seek his fortune in the Americas? The Spanish aristocracy developed a fatal mindset. Work was beneath them. Manual labor was for peasants. A true Spanish nobleman lived off rents and titles, not commerce or industry. This attitude, combined with endless colonial wealth, created a culture of economic parasitism. King Philip II tried to manage the crisis, but he was trapped in a vicious cycle. To maintain Spain's position as a global superpower, he needed to fund wars against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, against England and France whenever they threatened Spanish interests. Wars are expensive, incredibly expensive. Philip borrowed heavily from foreign bankers, especially the Fuggers of Germany and Genoese financiers. He promised to repay them with future silver shipments from the Americas, but the silver kept arriving, and somehow it was never enough. "Your Majesty," his finance minister said one afternoon, his voice trembling, "we cannot continue at this rate. The Treasury is empty again. The next treasure fleet won't arrive for 3 months, and we have debts due now." Philip rubbed his temples. "Borrow more." "From whom, Your Majesty? The Genoese are demanding higher interest rates. They no longer trust—" "I said, borrow more." Philip's voice echoed through the chamber. "Spain is the wealthiest kingdom on earth. We have entire mountains of silver. How can we be in debt?" But they were, deeply, catastrophically in debt. In 1557, Philip II did something unprecedented. He declared bankruptcy. He simply refused to pay his debts. The foreign bankers were furious, but what could they do? Spain was too powerful to invade, too important to ignore. But this wasn't the end of Spain's financial troubles. It was only the beginning. Philip declared bankruptcy again in 1560, and again in 1575, and again in 1596. Each time he thought the next treasure fleet would solve everything. Each time, the problem only got worse. The Spanish economy was trapped in what modern economists would call a resource curse. The very wealth that should have made Spain invincible was destroying it from within. The endless flow of precious metals made Spanish goods expensive and uncompetitive. It discouraged domestic industry. It created a culture of debt and dependency. Meanwhile, Spain's rivals were learning from their mistakes. England, France, and the Netherlands were building navies, investing in trade, developing manufacturing. They were getting stronger, while Spain, swimming in gold, was getting weaker. One of Philip's advisors, a clear-thinking economist named Martín de Azpilicueta, tried to explain what was happening.
"Your Majesty," he said carefully, "wealth is not measured in gold alone. It is measured in what a nation can produce, what it can build, what it can create. We have gold, yes, but we create nothing. We are rich in metal and poor in everything that matters." Philip dismissed him. How could a kingdom with mountains of silver be poor? It made no sense. But the evidence was everywhere. Spanish soldiers went unpaid and mutinied. Spanish ships rotted in harbors because there was no money to maintain them. The famous Spanish Armada, sent to invade England in 1588, was defeated not only by English ships and bad weather, but by years of financial neglect that left the fleet poorly maintained and undersupplied. The treasure fleet still arrived, Potosi still produced, but the gold slipped through Spain's fingers like water through a net. And the worst was about to come, because Spain's economic collapse would trigger something far more devastating than bankruptcy. It would destroy the very fabric of the empire itself.
By the early 1600s, Spain was in crisis. Not the kind of crisis that's obvious to outsiders. The royal court still glittered, the colonies still sent treasure, but the kind of crisis that eats a nation from within. King Philip III inherited his father's empire and his father's debts. He was a weaker king, more interested in hunting and religious festivals than governance. He delegated power to his advisors, who were often corrupt and incompetent. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Spain's population was declining. Endless wars, plagues, and emigration to the Americas had drained the country of working-age men. Fields lay fallow, villages were abandoned. The economy, already strained, began to collapse entirely. And still, the treasure ships kept coming. It was surreal. Spain was simultaneously the richest and poorest nation in Europe. They had gold, but they couldn't feed their people. They had silver, but they couldn't pay their soldiers. They controlled vast territories, but they couldn't defend them effectively. The Dutch Republic, once a Spanish possession, had successfully revolted and become an independent nation. They built a powerful merchant fleet and became the trading hub of Europe. Spanish silver flowed into Amsterdam, enriching Spain's former subjects, while Spain itself stagnated. England, under Queen Elizabeth I and later James I, developed an aggressive naval policy, raiding Spanish treasure fleets and establishing their own colonies. The English didn't have gold mines, but they had something more valuable, a growing economy based on trade, manufacturing, and innovation. France, though often at war with Spain, maintained a more balanced economy. They had agriculture, industry, and trade. They didn't have Potosi, but they didn't need it. They were building real wealth. Spain, meanwhile, was trapped in a death spiral. The more silver they extracted from the Americas, the more prices rose at home. The more prices rose, the less competitive Spanish goods became. The less competitive their economy, the more they relied on imports. The more they imported, the more gold flowed out of the country. One particularly insightful Spanish scholar, Francisco Martínez de Mata, wrote a devastating analysis. Spain is like a stomach that receives food but cannot digest it. The gold and silver pass through our hands and into the hands of foreigners, who provide us with everything we consume. We have become a nation of beggars sitting on a throne of gold. His words were prophetic. In 1627, under Philip IV, Spain declared bankruptcy for the fourth time. This time, the consequences were catastrophic. Foreign bankers refused to lend anymore. The Spanish army in Flanders mutinied when their pay didn't arrive. Spanish naval power, once supreme, declined as ships weren't maintained or replaced. The empire was crumbling, and everyone could see it except the Spanish court, which continued to live in denial, clinging to the fantasy that the next treasure fleet would solve everything. But there was a deeper problem, one that went beyond economics, the social and psychological impact of the gold rush. Spain had developed what historians call a rentier mentality, the belief that wealth should come from ownership and extraction, not from work and innovation. The Spanish nobility looked down on merchants and manufacturers. Commerce was considered degrading. The most respected path for a young man was to become a priest, a soldier, or a bureaucrat managing colonial affairs. No one wanted to build things, to innovate, to compete in the marketplace. This attitude poisoned Spanish society. While Dutch merchants were creating joint stock companies and developing modern banking, Spanish nobles were obsessing over bloodlines and titles. While English inventors were experimenting with new technologies, Spanish intellectuals were debating theology and censoring books that challenged church doctrine. The gold had made Spain intellectually lazy, economically dependent, and strategically vulnerable. In 1640, the unthinkable happened. Portugal, which had been ruled by Spain for 60 years, successfully revolted and regained independence. The Spanish military, stretched thin and underfunded, couldn't stop them. Then Catalonia rebelled, then Naples, then Sicily. The empire was falling apart, province by province, territory by territory. King Philip IV sat in his palace, surrounded by paintings by Velázquez, gold candlesticks from the Americas, and priceless tapestries from Flanders. He was the king of a dying empire, wealthy in objects, but bankrupt in power. "How did this happen?" he asked his chief minister, the Count Duke of Olivares. "We have the richest colonies in the world. We have mountains of silver. How are we losing?" Olivares had no answer, or rather, he had an answer, but it was too painful to speak aloud. Spain won the lottery and spent it all on lottery tickets. The final act of Spain's golden tragedy was about to unfold, and it would reveal a truth that every empire, every nation, every person must eventually learn. Real wealth isn't found in what you take from the earth. It's built by what you create with your hands and mind.
By 1700, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty had come to an end. King Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, died without an heir. He was sickly, mentally impaired from generations of inbreeding, and a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the Spanish Empire. The War of Spanish Succession followed, a brutal conflict that would determine who would rule Spain. When the dust settled, a new dynasty, the Bourbons, took the throne. They inherited an empire that was a shadow of its former glory. The treasure fleet still arrived from the Americas, but they were smaller now, less frequent. Potosi's silver mines, once seemingly inexhaustible, were depleting. The flow of precious metals that had sustained the empire for 2 centuries was drying up. But here's the strange thing. As the gold decreased, Spain's economy slowly began to stabilize. The new Bourbon kings, particularly Charles III in the late 1700s, implemented reforms. They invested in infrastructure, encouraged domestic manufacturing, reformed the tax system, and promoted education. They tried to rebuild what the gold rush had destroyed, a productive, innovative economy. It was too late to restore Spain to its former dominance. That moment had passed, but it was enough to prevent total collapse. Spain survived, diminished but intact, and slowly learned to function without the colonial wealth that had once defined it. Meanwhile, the lessons of Spain's failure were not lost on other nations. Economists across Europe studied what had happened to Spain and developed theories about wealth, trade, and economic policy. Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, explicitly used Spain as an example of how precious metals alone do not create prosperity. The real lesson was simple but profound. Wealth is not what you have, it's what you can do. Spain had gold, but it couldn't manufacture goods as efficiently as England. It had silver, but it couldn't trade as effectively as the Dutch. It had vast territories, but it couldn't innovate like the French. The nations that surpassed Spain didn't do so because they found gold mines. They did so because they built institutions, educated their people, invested in technology, and created economic systems that rewarded productivity and innovation. England became a global superpower not by extracting precious metals, but by developing industry, banking, and trade networks. The Netherlands became wealthy not through conquest, but through commerce and finance. These nations understood something Spain never grasped. Sustainable wealth comes from creation, not extraction. Looking back at the Spanish Empire's golden age, historians see a tragic irony. The greatest treasure Spain found in the Americas wasn't the silver of Potosi or the gold of Mexico. It was the land itself, the agricultural potential, the opportunity to build something lasting. But Spain squandered that opportunity, obsessed with the quick wealth of mining while neglecting the slow wealth of building. There's a story, probably apocryphal but symbolically true, about a Spanish official in the early 1800s visiting a British factory. He watched steam-powered machines weaving cloth, watched workers producing goods at a scale and speed impossible by hand. He turned to his British host and said bitterly, "We had the gold to build all this first. Why didn't we?" The British host supposedly replied, "Because you had the gold." That paradox that having too much easy wealth prevented Spain from building real prosperity is the heart of the Spanish tragedy. The gold rush didn't enrich Spain, it drained it. The treasure didn't make the empire strong, it made it dependent, complacent, and ultimately vulnerable. By the 1800s, Spain had lost most of its American colonies. The independence movement swept through Latin America, and Spain was too weak to stop them. The empire that once controlled half the world shrank to its European core plus a few scattered possessions. But Spain endured. It survived its golden age and the catastrophic hangover that followed. It learned, painfully and slowly, to build an economy based on production rather than extraction, on work rather than windfall. Today, Spain is a prosperous, modern nation, not the wealthiest in Europe, not the most powerful, but stable, democratic, and economically healthy. The gold is long gone, spent and squandered centuries ago, but Spain finally discovered what the gold rush obscured. Real wealth was inside them all along, waiting to be built. The Spanish Empire's rise and fall remains one of history's greatest cautionary tales. It reminds us that resources are not destiny, that easy money can be harder to manage than scarcity, and that the path to lasting prosperity isn't found in what we dig from the earth, it's built by what we create with our minds and hands. Spain discovered mountains of gold and drowned in them. Perhaps that's the most valuable treasure they left us, the knowledge that some fortunes are too heavy to carry, and that the real gold is in what we build, not what we find.
This is the story of how infinite wealth became infinite poverty, how an empire choked on its own treasure. If this story made you think differently about wealth, success, and what really makes a nation strong, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from history. And tell us in the comments, what do you think is the modern equivalent of Spain's gold rush? What easy wealth might be making us weaker today? We'll see you in the next story.